Listen closely. Somewhere in the wet heat of Reconstruction-era Louisiana, powerful men went to bed believing themselves untouchable and woke up with their throats opened by someone they never saw coming. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore. This is a lesson about power, deception, and what happens when systems built on terror forget that terror cuts both ways. You have been taught that history moves forward through speeches, laws, and armies. That is a comforting lie. Real history moves through shadows, through bedrooms with locked doors, through whispered agreements and sealed records. In the summer of 1872, 11 men learned that truth in the most intimate way possible. They were not drunks or vagrants. They were judges, bankers, landowners, sheriff's men who believed the world bent naturally toward their will. Men who belonged to a private order that did not wear hoods or burn crosses, because it did not need to. Controlled courts, controlled credit, controlled fear. Officially, their deaths were accidents of a violent time. Unrelated, unremarkable, filed away and buried. But power does not erase memory. It only drives it underground. In the quarters where freed men and women gathered, in churches where the walls heard more truth than any courthouse, another narrative survived. A dangerous one. A story about a woman who understood men like these better than they understood themselves. She did not storm buildings or give speeches. She did not raise an army. She walked softly into their world and let them invite her in. That is the first forbidden lesson. Systems of domination are most vulnerable where they indulge themselves. Every hierarchy has a private weakness, and it is almost always desire to be seen, to be chosen, to be exceptional. The men of this order believed violence was a tool only they could wield. They believed intimidation flowed in one direction. They believed women existed on the margins of real power. And they believed that history would remember them, if at all, as respectable guardians of order in a chaotic time. They were wrong on every count. What you are about to hear is not just about revenge. It is about intelligence, about patience, about psychological warfare conducted one-on-one, behind closed doors, about how a single operator, working inside an enemy's blind spots, can dismantle an entire structure without firing a shot. Understand this before we go any further. Once you see how this was done, you will never look at power the same way again. To understand how this was possible, you have to understand the environment these men built for themselves after the war. Reconstruction did not feel like reconciliation to them. Felt like occupation. Federal uniforms in former plantation towns. Freedmen voting, testifying, owning land. Courts no longer automatically bending to white authority. For men who had ruled by birthright and brutality, this was psychological collapse disguised as political change. So they adapted. Publicly, they spoke the language of law and order. Privately, they engineered compliance. Credit could be revoked. Crops could burn. A man's reputation could be quietly destroyed. And if that failed, there were night visits well-dressed, calm, reasonable men explaining consequences. No masks. No chows. Just certainty. This was not mob violence. It was management. Their greatest advantage was invisibility. They were the sheriff investigating the crime, the judge interpreting the law, the banker deciding who deserved a loan. When violence occurred, they explained it. When evidence contradicted them, they refiled it. When witnesses spoke out of turn, those witnesses learned the cost of memory. This is how institutional power actually functions. Not through spectacle, but through administrative control. Into this closed circuit stepped a woman calling herself a widow, respectable, educated, financially independent enough to raise no alarms. She did not challenge their authority. She validated it. She allowed them to perform the role they most cherished: protector, guide, benefactor. She never argued politics. She never defended freed men. She never condemned violence. She listened. And men like this mistake listening for loyalty. Here is the second forbidden lesson. Predators are conditioned to ignore threats that do not look like resistance. They scan for anger, defiance, opposition. They do not scan for empathy. They do not scan for intimacy. They do not scan for a woman who appears to need them. Each man believed he was acting alone. Each believed he had discovered something special, an unspoken understanding, a private bond. That belief fractured their unity long before a blade ever touched flesh. Subtle rivalries emerged. Meetings lost focus. Decisions slowed. Power structures depend on internal trust, and desire corrodes trust faster than any outside enemy. Meanwhile, she documented everything. Habits, routines, weaknesses, not just physical but moral. Who drank too much, who feared scandal, who slept alone, who believed God would forgive anything done in defense of order. This was not impulsive violence. It was reconnaissance. And the most dangerous part? She did not see these men as monsters. She saw them as systems. Predictable, repetitive, arrogant. Systems do not feel fear until they fail. And by the time the first body was found, the system was already collapsing from the inside. This is where the descent truly begins. By late spring of 1872, she had woven herself seamlessly into the social fabric of Bro Bridge. Not as an agitator, not as a spy in the traditional sense. She was a widow in mourning, sophisticated, composed, carrying the aura of a life lived elsewhere, untouched by the chaos of Reconstruction. And yet, every glance she offered, every fleeting smile, was a calculated vector, a probe into the minds of the men who believed themselves untouchable. This is where human psychology meets strategy. Power always overestimates itself. The men of the Knights of the White Camellia, lawyers, plantation owners, former officers, believed intellect alone shielded them from threat. They underestimated desire, underappreciated vanity, and they never suspected that the weapon capable of ending them would be seated quietly at a table across from them, asking nothing but permission to exist in their world. Her method was subtle. She engaged them in conversation, allowed them to offer aid, invited them to provide protection, and above all, gave them the illusion that they alone possessed her trust. One by one, they fell into the trap of their own hubris. Each man began to compete for her attention, each trying to outmaneuver the other in the quietest, most gentlemanly ways. And every time they did, they revealed themselves further habits, secrets, weaknesses that would later be exploited with surgical precision. It is important that you understand the scale of her operation. 11 men were under her scrutiny. 11 men who had wielded control over life and death, who had made a mockery of justice, who had terrorized communities with impunity. And yet, she made them powerless without lifting a hand in anger. Power, when held with arrogance, blinds its owner. Even a single carefully trained observer can dismantle it if patience and perception are employed. She kept meticulous records entries in a leather-bound journal noting each man's routines, his defenses, his private rituals. Who slept with the window open, who kept a pistol under the pillow, who allowed his wife to stay in a separate room. Nothing was left to chance. Everything was catalogued. This was not passion. This was preparation. A map of vulnerability drawn with precision and patience. And then came the first death. Not a warning shot, not an indiscriminate attack, but a carefully executed strike at the exact moment when the system of arrogance, desire, and trust intersected in one location. A bedroom at dawn, where Thomas Brossard, powerful and feared, finally met the consequence of underestimating a quiet observer. When his body was discovered, the official narrative was mundane, a lone intruder, perhaps a disgruntled freedman, seeking vengeance. But the truth, known only in whispers, was far darker, and it would not stop with him. Every detail she had gathered, every moment of attention she had elicited, was about to be used to dismantle the entire circle. Remember this: real control is invisible. And real vengeance does not announce itself. It waits, calculating, until the moment when the illusion of security shatters completely. Do not scroll yet. Think about this. In a world built to protect the powerful, what weapons exist for the observant, the patient, the clever? Keep that question in mind as we descend deeper. The night Thomas Brossard died, the parish was heavy with heat and expectation. No one outside his household suspected that anything unusual would occur. To the casual observer, the widow Celeste Defrain was as she had always been, composed, dignified, and wholly unremarkable. But within the walls of Brossard's plantation house, everything shifted in an instant. The world these men had built, their sense of invincibility, their mastery over people, law, and fear collapsed in the precise silence of a bedroom at dawn. Consider this. Brossard was a man who had made others kneel before him, who had burned crops, destroyed reputations, and wielded violence with calculated restraint. Yet he did not see the threat at his side. He had been seduced, yes, in more than one sense of the word, but more importantly, he had been studied. Every habit, every private desire, every moment of vulnerability catalogued. And when Celeste acted, it was not out of passion. It was the execution of an exact plan. One cut, precise, leaving him drained, eyes closed, face calm, almost serene. There is a deeper lesson here. The most dangerous kind of predator is the one who makes the prey complicit in its own undoing. Brossard's attention, his pride, his ego, they became instruments in their own destruction. The very systems he had relied upon, his wife's trust, his domestic routine, his belief in his own cunning, were the mechanisms of his vulnerability. Celeste did not need brute force. She needed the truth. That control is only as strong as the blind spots of those who believe they hold it. When the body was discovered, the official story followed the pattern of every death before it. A lone intruder, a random act of violence, something easily explained away to prevent panic and maintain the illusion of order. The sheriff and coroner observed, documented, and filed reports that ignored the whispers of those who had seen her come into town. And in doing so, they became accomplices whether they knew it or not. This is the third hidden truth. Institutions protect themselves first, truth second. Meanwhile, Celeste did not pause. Each night, she reviewed her journal, recalibrated, and prepared for the next target. 11 men, each with their own schedule, their own routines, their own blind spots. And all the while, the circle of power among them began to fray. The men who had once trusted each other implicitly now watched each other, compared their interactions with her, and felt unease they could not identify. Desire, secrecy, and competition, these were the tools that tore the inner circle apart faster than any weapon could. Understand this. Real power does not announce itself. It infiltrates quietly, subtly, and with a patience that outlasts fear and arrogance. And the first death is only the beginning. Once the seed of doubt, the fracture of trust, the recognition of vulnerability takes root, the entire structure can collapse from within. That is the danger, the true horror, and the lesson these men paid for with their lives. Halfway through our descent, I need you to do something for me. Type the phrase, "I see the hidden" twice in the comments below. Lock it in. Claim it. Let it mark your awareness. Because the knowledge you are absorbing now is not casual. It is transformative. It is dangerous. It changes the way you see power, fear, and human weakness forever. When you have done that, keep watching. The next section will take you deeper into obsession, corruption, and the precise, merciless execution of retribution. By July of 1872, the air in St. Martin Parish was thick with heat and with tension. Each man in the night's inner circle believed himself untouchable, yet the first death had planted a seed of unease. Subtle rivalries, already stoked by Celeste's presence, intensified. Men who had once met in consensus now measured their words, their glances, and their gestures, each unconsciously competing for her attention, each exposing a weakness they had never intended to reveal. The very structure of their dominance began to unravel from within, thread by thread. Celeste moved with deliberate grace, observing, calculating, and refining. She never acted hastily. Every encounter, every conversation, every small favor accepted from these men was carefully recorded. Who trusted her? Who coveted her attention? Who allowed desire to override judgment? These details, invisible to everyone else, were the map to destruction. And she knew that timing would be everything. One misstep, one exposed plan, and all could fail. But patience was her ally, and the men themselves were her unwitting accomplices. The second death followed the same precise pattern. Not random, not chaotic. It was a lesson, and the lesson was psychological as much as physical. Power is a fragile illusion, especially when its holders are intoxicated by self-importance. Dr. Raymond Heber, a man who had spent years determining the causes of death for others, became the next target. The irony is deliberate. The coroner, the man trained to dissect mortality, could not see the blade coming for him. In his bedroom, calm and orderly, he fell asleep believing he was safe. The world had taught him wrong. What is terrifying is not the act itself but the orchestration, the strategy. Celeste did not merely kill. She dismantled. She engineered doubt, rivalry, and obsession, then struck at the precise moment when the system was most vulnerable. Each murder was a message. No amount of social standing, legal knowledge, or community influence could shield you from the consequences of underestimating the unseen. And by the time authorities filed their reports, the true nature of the threat had already disappeared into whispers and shadows. Here is a fourth truth. Fear is only effective when it is invisible. These men had lived by fear. They had inflicted it on entire communities. But now they understood that fear could be wielded against them, quietly, personally, and with surgical precision. Every knife stroke, every silent approach in the night was a revelation of what happens when the powerful ignore their blind spots, when arrogance blinds foresight, when obsession replaces reason. By the third death, the inner circle was fractured, paranoia taking root alongside grief. Celeste had proven that knowledge, patience, and a careful study of human behavior could dismantle even the most formidable structures of power. And yet, her work was far from complete. 11 men, 11 lessons, 11 acts of justice calculated with the cold logic of someone who knew that the system itself could be weaponized. The next section will take us even deeper, into the mind of a predator operating within a web of men who believed themselves untouchable, and the terrifying precision of their downfall. By the time the fourth man fell, the Knights of the White Camellia were no longer a cohesive unit. The subtle rivalries Celeste had sown had metastasized into paranoia. Each man suspected the other of overstepping, of attempting to gain favor, of knowing more than he should. Their unity, once their greatest weapon, had become their greatest vulnerability, and they did not realize it because arrogance blinds faster than fear, and desire corrodes judgment more thoroughly than any external threat. Celeste had mastered a truth that most never even consider. Power is as fragile as perception. It is not the strongest arm or the sharpest blade that rules, but the mind that can navigate influence, desire, and expectation simultaneously. She knew each man's pattern, the hours they slept, the habits they trusted, the routines they never doubted. Her kills were surgical, intimate, precise. There was no frenzy, no rage, only method, and the cold certainty of inevitability. The inner circle's attention had shifted from governance to obsession. Each man monitored his peers, trying to anticipate moves, trying to secure her attention, trying to predict who would be next. Meanwhile, Celeste watched silently, recording, calculating, and waiting for the perfect alignment. She understood that chaos is more devastating when it emerges from within rather than without. External threats can be defended against. Internal collapse cannot. What makes this story far darker than simple revenge is the psychology of it. These men were hunters used to controlling others. They had terrorized freedmen, intimidated rivals, and manipulated institutions to maintain dominance. And yet, The one they considered powerless, a woman who, by all social measures, should have been vulnerable, became the instrument of their undoing. This inversion of power is not poetic. It is instructive. Power exists only where it is respected and unchallenged. When that respect is exploited, the hierarchy collapses like a house of cards. The fifth and sixth deaths were not merely executions, they were psychological warfare. Each murder was tailored to shatter confidence, to magnify suspicion, to erode trust in the men who had believed themselves masters. And as the bodies were discovered, the official narrative grew more absurd, more desperate. Local authorities refused to acknowledge a pattern. The system's credibility became another weapon wielded against the knights themselves. Pause and reflect. This is the real lesson hidden in shadows of history. Violence is simple. Strategy, patience, and understanding human desire is devastating. Celeste did not need armies. She did not need riots. She did not need to burn buildings or threaten communities. She needed knowledge, observation, and the men's own weaknesses. The weapon of insight can be far deadlier than any knife. Before we move to the seventh section, I want you to commit again. Type the phrase, "I see the hidden," twice in the comments. Let it anchor you. Let it mark that you are awake to the mechanics of influence, obsession, and the fragility of power. Because what comes next will be a descent into the final unraveling, and it is not for the faint of heart. By the seventh death, the parish itself seemed to hold its breath. Whispers had begun to circulate among the townspeople, careful and hushed, yet carrying a weight heavier than any official report. The knights were no longer confident. Their meetings became tense, their words clipped. Every glance was measured, every gesture calculated. They were hunting shadows now, not criminals. They could not see her, and in that invisibility lay the most terrifying truth. A predator who strikes unseen is invincible. Celeste's approach was no longer just about removing her targets, it was about mastery. Each act was designed not only to kill but to destabilize. By the seventh strike, the remaining men no longer trusted themselves, nor each other. Patterns they had relied upon for decades, habit, routine, expectation, were now chains, each one exposed to manipulation. Fear had entered their veins, but it was not the fear of a stranger. It was the fear of betrayal, of vulnerability, of the realization that their own desire had been used as a weapon against them. This is the darkest lesson. Power, when exercised without humility, blinds the wielder to the most obvious danger. Men who believe themselves untouchable are often the easiest prey. They ignore what does not seem threatening. They fail to question the intentions of those who appear compliant or deferential. Celeste understood this. She knew that to strike effectively, one must first render the target blind to threat. Desire, trust, obsession, these were her instruments, and they had never failed. Each murder followed the same haunting pattern. Executed in the sanctity of their bedrooms, silent, precise, intimate. No robbery, no political statement, no noise. Just a meticulous obliteration of the men who had ruled through fear, and a message that fear could be wielded against them, quietly, efficiently, and personally. By now, local authorities were grasping at incoherent explanations. Random intruders, unrelated vendettas, coincidence. But the truth had already vanished into the whispers of those who had always known it, the communities that had long been oppressed by the same hands now emptied, by someone who understood the very mechanics of domination better than its operators. By this point, you should be asking yourself, if one person, patient and observant, can dismantle an entire system of power, what does that say about the illusions we trust? About hierarchies, institutions, and the facades of authority? Every man she killed had thought himself invulnerable. Every structure he relied upon had been designed to reinforce that illusion. And every illusion was weaponized against him. As we move to the final section, understand this: history does not remember those who fall quietly. It remembers the systems they upheld and the shadows they never saw coming. The final act is not just the conclusion of murder, it is the revelation of the truth, the awakening of awareness, and the ultimate dismantling of arrogance in its purest form. What comes next will seal the lesson, and it will linger long after the story is told. The final act was not sudden. It was a culmination of precision, patience, and understanding of human fragility. By the eighth man, the knights were fractured, their confidence shattered. Meetings that once dictated the lives of others became exercises in suspicion. Each man watched the other, every glance heavy with doubt. They no longer operated as a circle. They were isolated, each a target of his own obsession, each unaware that the very desires that had driven them to her now made them vulnerable. Celeste's methods were subtle, almost artistic. She did not need chaos to accomplish her mission. She needed routine, predictability, and blind trust. The remaining men had been studied for weeks, sometimes months. Every habit catalogued, every weakness observed, every blind spot memorized. She struck where the system was weakest, in the private chambers where pride, lust, and vanity had always convinced these men of their safety. There was no struggle, no fear, only the precise mechanics of inevitability. Each cut a statement about the cost of underestimating intelligence, patience, and focus. As the final men fell, the system these men had built, the courts they controlled, the stores they dominated, the social order they enforced did not merely lose leaders. It collapsed psychologically, morally, and symbolically. What had seemed indomitable was revealed as fragile. The people who had once lived under their intimidation now witnessed the power of observation, patience, and calculated precision. A single operator, unseen, had dismantled an entire hierarchy without armies or weapons beyond cunning and resolve. The aftermath was telling. Official records were sealed, explanations manufactured, blame deflected. The public narrative told of random violence and misfortune. But the hidden history, the one whispered in back rooms, passed from one generation to the next, remembered Celeste as a force that exposed arrogance and hubris for what it was. 11 men, each powerful in his own right, fell to the simple yet profound realization that systems, no matter how sophisticated, are only as strong as the people who believe in them without question. And here is the ultimate truth. Power is not the ability to control others. It is the ability to see, understand, and anticipate. Those who believe themselves untouchable are often blind to the most basic rules of survival. Observation, patience, and the acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, is always watching, always calculating, always waiting for the precise moment to act. Let this knowledge settle. Reflect on how desire, trust, and ego can blind even the most formidable individuals. And remember the phrase you wrote earlier, the key to your own awakening. I see the hidden. That is not merely a phrase. It is a mindset, a lens to perceive the unseen, the unspoken, and the dangerous truths buried beneath layers of history and human arrogance. This is how the powerful fall. Quietly, predictably, inevitably. And this, finally, is the story you were never meant to hear. Comment below with "I see the hidden" twice if you're ready to uncover truths history tried to bury. Share this with someone who thinks they can handle forbidden knowledge. Because once you see it, nothing is the same again.